The silence in the dining room of Blackwood Estate was a physical presence. It was heavier than the crystal chandelier hanging above the 20-foot mahogany table. It was colder than the marble floors that gleamed under the afternoon light, reflecting a world of polished, empty perfection. My world. I ran a gloved finger along the surface of a silver candlestick, my reflection staring back at me, distorted and severe. Impeccable. That was the word I lived by, the word that held the pieces of my life together. Behind me, a soft, shuffling sound. Clara, the new maid. She moved through my house like a ghost, a whisper of faded cotton and cheap soap. I despised the sound. It was an apology for existing. I turned slowly, my silk dress making no noise. She was holding a polishing cloth, her head bowed, her plain brown hair escaping a loose knot at the nape of her neck. She looked like a frightened mouse, perpetually braced for the snap of a trap. It was a look I cultivated in my staff. It made things simpler. "Clara," I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast room. "Come here." She flinched as if the sound of her own name was a lash. "Yes, Mrs. Vance." She scurried closer, her eyes fixed on the floor somewhere near my expensive shoes. I held up the candlestick. "Look at this. Do you see the film near the base? A faint, almost invisible cloudiness that only a truly discerning eye would notice." "My eye," she squinted. I think so, Mrs. Vance. Thinking is not your job, Clara. Observing is. And following instructions is paramount." I placed the heavy silver piece into her hands. Her fingers, chapped and red, closed around the cool metal. They looked grotesque against its pristine shine. "You are using the wrong pressure," I continued, my tone patient, the way one might speak to a particularly slow child. "You are rubbing, not polishing. You must use small, tight, circular motions, like this." I took her hand in mine, forcing her fingers to move correctly on the silver. Her skin was surprisingly warm. The contact was unpleasant. I felt a sudden, strange urge to wash my hands. She tensed under my touch, her breath catching. "I am sorry, Mrs. Vance. I will do better." Her voice was soft, barely audible. It was a voice that knew its place, a voice that would never challenge, never question, never demand. It was, I had thought, the perfect voice for this house. I released her hand abruptly. "See that you do. The Thorne family silver has been in my husband's lineage for over a century. It is not merely a collection of objects. It is a statement. It requires respect." "Yes, Mrs. Vance." I watched her for a moment longer. She returned to her work, her shoulders hunched, her entire being focused on the task of erasing a smudge that I was likely the only person on earth to have noticed. There was a pathetic sort of diligence about her. I found it both irritating and, in a way, reassuring. She was a known quantity, simple, meek, and utterly powerless, a blank space in the grand design of my life. I walked to the towering windows that overlooked the manicured lawns. The grounds were flawless, the hedges sculpted into sharp geometric lines. Not a single leaf was out of place. It was a beautiful, sterile prison. My father had called this marriage a strategic alliance, a merger of two great families, the Vances and the Thornes. He spoke of power, influence, and legacy. He never spoke of love. Neither did Julian. Our wedding day was a masterpiece of social engineering. Hundreds of guests, an ocean of champagne, and two families smiling for the cameras, sealing a pact. Julian had stood beside me, devastatingly handsome in his custom-tailored suit. He looked less like a groom and more like a king, surveying a new territory. When he slid the diamond ring onto my finger, his touch was cold, his eyes assessing. I knew then with absolute certainty that this ring was not a symbol of affection. It was a contract, a beautiful, binding, and utterly hollow contract. In the years since, nothing had changed. We lived in the same house but in different worlds. My world was this one, a world of social calendars, charity galas, and the silent, ruthless enforcement of domestic perfection. Julian's world was elsewhere. It was a world of hushed phone calls behind the closed doors of his study, of late-night departures and early morning arrivals. He wore his power like he wore his black suits, with an effortless and chilling authority. I knew what he was. The world whispered it. A businessman, yes, but of a different, more dangerous sort. A man who commanded loyalty through fear. a man whose enemies had a tendency to disappear. I never asked questions. That was part of our unspoken agreement. I was his wife, the elegant and untouchable Mrs. Eleanor Vance. I provided him with a respectable facade, a link to old money and societal grace. In return, he provided me with this: the house, the cars, the endless river of funds that allowed me to build this perfect, cold life. He never pretended to love me, and for that, I was almost grateful. Pretense would have been a far greater insult. The sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway broke the silence. My heart gave a small, traitorous flutter. Julian. He was home early. I smoothed down the front of my dress, a reflex I hated. My posture was already perfect, my hair flawlessly arranged in its severe chignon. Yet his presence, even the thought of it, made me feel the need to check for imperfections. Clara stopped polishing, her hands frozen on the silver. She looked towards the front of the house, her expression unreadable for a moment before the meek mask slipped back into place. The heavy front door opened and closed with a solid, definitive click. The sound changed the atmosphere in the house. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged, waiting. I heard his footsteps on the marble floor of the grand foyer. Each step was measured, confident. The sound of a man who owned every space he entered. He appeared in the doorway of the dining room, and for a moment, he just stood there. Julian Thorne was not a man you simply saw. You felt his presence first. He filled the room, sucking the air from it. His black suit was immaculate, his dark hair perfectly styled. His gray eyes, the color of a stormy sea, swept the room and landed on me. A faint scar cut through one of his eyebrows, the only flaw on an otherwise perfect, severe face. Eleanor. His voice was low, a calm baritone that could soothe or terrify with the slightest change in inflection. Julian. I inclined my head, a chuitishin, gesture of a queen to her king. Welcome home. He crossed the room in a few long strides. The scent of expensive cologne, crisp night air, and something else, something metallic and dangerous, clung to him. He leaned in and pressed a kiss to my cheek. It was a dry, perfunctory gesture. The brush of his lips was cool against my skin. It was the same kiss he gave me every day. A formality, a tick on a checklist. There was no warmth in it, no passion. There never was. My fingers curled slightly at my sides. I could feel a familiar ache deep in my chest, a longing for something I couldn't even name, something real. I pushed it down, burying it under layers of pride and control. I was Eleanor Vance. I did not long for things I could not have. He pulled back, his eyes already moving past me, scanning the room. His gaze was always working, always calculating. He noticed everything. He straightened his tie, a small, unconscious gesture. Everything in order? He asked. It was not a question about my well-being. It was a question about his domain. Of course. I kept my voice even, betraying nothing. I was just instructing the new maid on the proper care of the silver. His eyes flickered towards Clara, who seemed to have shrunk into herself over by the sideboard. She was staring at a fork as if it held the secrets of the universe, desperately trying to be invisible. For a moment, Julian didn't say anything. He just looked at her. And it was then that I saw it. It was nothing. It was everything. As he began to walk towards the doorway leading to his study, he had to pass by her. And as he did, his pace did not falter, his expression did not change. But his eyes, for a fraction of a second, met hers. It was not a glance of a master to a servant. It was not a look of dismissal or acknowledgement. It was something else entirely. It was a silent, intimate communication that passed between them in the space of a heartbeat, a secret message that I was not privy to. In his eyes, I saw a flicker of something I had never seen directed at me, a softening, a warmth, and in hers, for that same infinitesimal moment, the fear was gone. It was replaced by a look of profound, unguarded recognition. It was as if two people, lost in a desert, had just found their oasis in each other's gaze. Then it was over. He was past her. Her head was bowed again, her shoulders slumped in that familiar, subservient posture. He was at the door to his study, turning the handle. The moment had vanished as quickly as it had appeared. It was so fast, so subtle, that I almost convinced myself I had imagined it. My mind raced, trying to process the impossible data point. Julian and the maid? The thought was absurd, laughable. Julian was a man of impeccable taste and ruthless standards. He viewed his marriage to me as a business arrangement, but he respected the terms. He would never risk the stability of his empire, the sanctity of his home, for a dalliance with a mousy, insignificant servant. It was beneath him. It was beneath me. And yet, the image was burned into my mind, the way his gaze had softened, the way her entire being had seemed to light up from within for just 1 second. It was a look that spoke of a shared history, a shared secret. No, I was being ridiculous. I was bored. The crushing, opulent boredom of my life was making me see things that weren't there. I was projecting my own dissatisfaction, my own secret loneliness onto them. It was a trick of the light, a flicker of shadow from the swaying chandelier. Julian paused at his study door, his hand on the knob. He looked back, not at me, but towards Clara. "The silver looks fine," he said, his voice flat. "Let her finish." He wasn't speaking to me. He was issuing a command, a protection. Then he was gone, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft, final click. The sound echoed in the cavernous dining room. I stood frozen for a long moment. The air still vibrated with his presence. The room felt emptier now and colder. My world, so carefully constructed, so perfectly controlled, suddenly felt fragile. A crack had appeared in the flawless, polished surface. I turned my head and looked at Clara. She was still polishing the same piece of silver, her movements now slow, almost reverent. Her head was bowed, but I could see the faintest hint of a curve on her lips. It was not a smile. It was the memory of one. My insides turned to ice. It wasn't my imagination. I drew myself up to my full height, my posture becoming a shield. The authority returned to my voice, colder and sharper than before. "Clara." She looked up, and this time she met my eyes for a second before looking away. "Yes, Mrs. Vance, leave it. You are dismissed for the day." "But I haven't finished I said. "You are dismissed." My voice cut through the air like glass. "Get out of my sight." A flicker of confusion, then fear, crossed her face. She set the candlestick down gently, her hands trembling slightly. She curtsied, a clumsy, nervous gesture, and practically fled from the room, her soft-soled shoes making frantic, whispering sounds on the marble floor. I was alone again. The silence rushed back in, but it was different now. It was no longer a heavy, empty silence. It was a listening silence, a knowing silence. It was filled with the ghost of a glance I was never meant to see. I walked over to the sideboard and picked up the candlestick Clara had been working on. It was flawless, gleaming. I held it up, and in its perfect curved surface, I saw my own reflection. A woman with hair of spun gold, eyes the color of a winter sky, and a mouth set in a firm, unhappy line. The queen of Blackwood Estate, a woman who had everything and nothing at all. I told myself it was nothing, a moment of paranoia, a figment of an idle mind. My husband was a powerful, complicated man. The maid was just a maid. To think otherwise was to indulge in a cheap, pathetic melodrama. I was Eleanor Vance. I did not engage in melodrama. But as I stood there, clutching the cold silver in my hand, a single poisonous seed of doubt was planted in the sterile soil of my heart. It was a tiny, insignificant thing, but I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone that it had already begun to take root, and I feared what terrible, ugly thing might grow from it in the silence of my perfect house. The doubt was a splinter, a tiny, insignificant thing that had worked its way under her skin. Eleanor tried to ignore it, to push it away with the routines that governed her life, the meticulous selection of her outfit for the day, the precise instructions to the kitchen staff, the silent, solitary breakfast in the cavernous dining room. But the splinter remained, a faint, persistent irritation. It was the memory of a glance, nothing more. A flicker of silent understanding between her husband, Julian, and the maid, Clara. It was absurd, pathetic even, to build a fortress of suspicion on such a flimsy foundation. She dismissed it again as she stood before her jewelry box, the polished mahogany gleaming under the soft morning light. A diamond earring, one of a pair Julian had given her for their 3rd anniversary. It was gone. She traced the velvet lining where it should have been, her finger coming up empty. A familiar spike of irritation shot through her. Things in her house did not go missing. Everything had a place. Everything was controlled. She had spent a decade perfecting this cold, orderly world. Her mind immediately went to Clara, the quiet, mousy girl who moved through the halls like a ghost. Had she been careless while cleaning? Perhaps she knocked it from the vanity, and it was now lost in the thick fibers of the Persian rug. Eleanor spent a full 10 minutes on her hands and knees, her silk dressing gown pooling around her, her manicured fingers combing through the carpet. Nothing. The annoyance began to curdle into something sharper. It was a 5-carat diamond, a stone that could change a life like Clara's. The thought was ugly, and she knew it. But the splinter of doubt was there, pulsing. The way Julian's eyes had softened for a fraction of a second. The way Clara had looked down, a faint flush on her cheeks. Had Eleanor imagined it? Or had she simply chosen not to see it until now? She stood up, brushing down her gown, her movements stiff. She would search the girl's room. She would tell herself it was about the earring. It was a logical, necessary step to recover her property. But a cold, dark part of her knew the truth. She wasn't looking for a diamond. She was looking for an answer. The staff quarters were in a separate wing of the Blackwood estate, a place Eleanor had never set foot in. The hallway was narrower here, the marble floors replaced with simple, polished wood. The air smelled different, cleaner, but without the expensive, cloying scent of the lilies she insisted on for the main foyer. It smelled of laundry soap and humility. The thought made her lip curl. She found the door marked with a small, neat plaque. Clara Rossi. Her hand hovered over the simple brass knob. This was a violation, a crossing of a line. But the need to know, the gnawing suspicion, was stronger than her sense of propriety. She turned the knob and pushed the door open. The room was just as she expected, small, sparse, and impeccably clean. A single bed was made with military precision, the white coverlet tucked in tightly. A small, dark wood nightstand held a single book and a glass of water. A modest wardrobe stood against the far wall. There were no pictures on the walls, no trinkets, no personal touches of any kind. It was the room of someone who did not plan to stay, or someone who was hiding. Eleanor felt a strange pang of something. It wasn't pity. Perhaps it was a cold sort of satisfaction. This was Clara's world, a tiny barren box, while Eleanor commanded an empire of marble and glass. The comparison should have soothed her, reasserted her dominance. Instead, it only made the splinter dig deeper. Why would Julian, a man who commanded legions and lived in splendor, spare a second glance for a creature from a world like this? She started her search, the excuse of the earring a flimsy shield for her true purpose. She ran her hands along the top of the wardrobe, checked the pockets of the simple black dress hanging inside. Nothing. She knelt and looked under his bed, her eyes meeting only dust bunnies in the dark, empty space. Her frustration grew with every empty drawer she pulled open. Neatly folded, plain underthings. A few simple blouses, a worn gray sweater. There was no diamond, there was nothing of value at all. Her heart was beating too fast. This was ridiculous. She was Eleanor Vance. She did not grovel on the floor of a servant's room. She was about to stand, to retreat back to her own world and pretend this humiliating episode never happened. But her eyes fell on the bed, on the pillow. It was just a plain white pillow, but something about it seemed wrong. It was plump just so, but there was a subtle, almost imperceptible lump beneath the surface right in the center. Slowly, she reached out, her fingers trembling slightly. She slid her hand under the cool cotton of the pillowcase. Her skin brushed against something hard and cold. Metal. Her breath caught in her throat. She pulled it out. It was a locket, a simple heart-shaped silver locket on a delicate, thin chain. It was tarnished at the edges, the kind of cheap jewelry a teenage girl might buy for herself. It was utterly out of place in this house, an object of sentiment in a world that had none. Eleanor stared at it, her knuckles white as she clutched the small, metallic heart in her palm. It wasn't a diamond earring. It was something far, far worse. This was a secret. Her suspicion, once a vague and shapeless mist, began to solidify into a cold, heavy dread. Why would Clara, the girl with nothing, hide this one cheap thing so carefully? Who gave it to her? The answer screamed at her from the silent corners of her mind, but she refused to hear it. Not yet. She had to be sure. She had to see. Her thumbnail scraped against the side of the locket, searching for the clasp. It was stiff, sealed shut by time and disuse, or perhaps by the sheer will of its owner to keep its contents hidden. She fumbled with it, her usual grace and composure gone. A frantic, ugly desperation took over. The silver was cold against her skin, but a fire was building in her chest, a blaze of fury and a terrifying, icy fear. She felt a sudden, sharp need to throw it across the room, to leave it be, to walk out of this small, sad room and go back to her life of perfect, cold order. If she didn't open it, she wouldn't know. If she didn't know, it wouldn't be real. She could go back to dismissing the memory of that shared glance. She could continue to be Mrs. Julian Thorne, mistress of the Blackwood estate, a woman envied by all, a woman in control. But she knew she was already past that point. The splinter was no longer a splinter. It was a blade twisting in her gut. She had to know what was inside. She had to see the face of her own ruin. With a final determined push of her thumbnail, the clasp gave way. The locket sprang open in her palm. Time stopped. The air in the room grew thick and heavy, pressing down on her. Inside, protected by two tiny curved frames of silver, was a photograph. It was old, the colors faded to a soft sepia tone. It was a picture of two people, a boy and a girl. They were young, so painfully young, maybe 16, 17 at most. The girl was unmistakably Clara, but it was a Clara Eleanor had never seen. Her hair was loose, falling over her shoulders. Her face, free from the mask of servitude she wore in the mansion, was lit up with a brilliant, unguarded smile. She was beautiful. And the boy next to her, his arm was draped casually, protectively around her shoulder. He was thin, not yet filled out with the power and menace he would later carry like a second skin. But the intense gray eyes were the same. The dark hair was the same. The slight, almost imperceptible scar that cut through his eyebrow was the same. It was Julian, a version of her husband she had never known, had never even conceived of. A Julian before the tailored black suits, before the empire, before her. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at Clara. And the expression on his face, it shattered Eleanor's world. It was not the cool, appraising look he gave her. It was not the bored tolerance or the polite distance. It was pure, unadulterated adoration. A look of such profound tenderness and belonging that it felt like a physical blow. They were not just two people in a photograph. They were a universe unto themselves. A history, a beginning that predated her, a story in which she was not even a footnote. The arranged marriage, the strategic alliance, the cold, loveless contract she had accepted because it gave her status and power. When all of it was a lie, not a lie in its terms, but a lie in its context. She had thought she was a partner in a transaction, a queen on a loveless throne, but the faded photograph in her hand told a different story. Julian's heart had been given away long ago to the quiet, unassuming girl who polished her silver and served her tea. The air rushed out of her lungs. The room, which had seemed small and pathetic moments before, now felt vast and suffocating. The silence of the mansion was no longer peaceful. It was mocking. Every polished surface, every expensive object, every symbol of her power and her position was a hollow prop in a play where she had been the only one who didn't know her lines. She had mistaken her gilded cage for a castle. Her mind flashed back to every interaction. Every time Julian had spoken to Clara, his voice a little softer. Every time the maid had kept her eyes downcast, a gesture Eleanor had mistaken for fear or deference. It was not deference. It was concealment. They had been living a secret life right under her nose, in her own home. They had built their own private world in the shadows of hers. And she, with all her intelligence and obsession with control, had been completely, utterly blind. The arrogance drained out of her, replaced by a humiliation so profound it felt like acid in her veins. She thought of the glance in the dining room. It wasn't a flicker. It was a novel, a whole unspoken conversation that said, "I see you. I love you. Be patient." And she had been standing right there, an obstacle, a warden, A fool. The anger came then, hot and sharp, a welcome sensation after the cold shock. Anger at Julian for his deception. Anger at Clara for her quiet, devastating betrayal. But most of all, a white-hot, consuming anger at herself for her own blindness. Her fingers, which had been trembling, were now rigid. With a sharp, violent snap, she closed the locket. The click echoed in the silent room like a gunshot. She stared down at the small, silver heart in her hand. It was no longer just a piece of cheap jewelry. It was a weapon. It was the proof. It was the key to the truth she had stumbled upon, a truth that was about to bring her entire, carefully constructed world crashing down. The cold metal felt like it was branding her skin, searing a mark of betrayal and loss directly into her palm. The polished floors of the Blackwood estate seemed to tilt beneath her feet. The foundation was gone, and she was in freefall. The silver locket lay on the polished surface of her vanity. It was a cold, alien object in a room of curated perfection. Eleanor sat before the mirror, but she did not see her own reflection. She saw the ghost of a younger Julian, his arm draped around a smiling, innocent girl. A girl who now drifted through her house like a shadow, polishing silver and arranging flowers. Her hands, which had been trembling, were now perfectly still in her lap. The shock had passed, leaving behind a frozen, crystalline rage. The world had not crumbled. It had simply revealed itself to be a lie, and Eleanor Vance did not tolerate lies. Her life was a contract, a strategic alliance of wealth and power. She had always understood this. Love was a currency for poets and fools, not for families like hers. But respect, loyalty, discretion, these were the non-negotiable terms. Julian had not just broken the terms, he had mocked them. He had hidden his betrayal in plain sight, dressing it in a maid's uniform and installing it in their home. The audacity of it was a physical insult, a weight pressing down on her chest. She picked up her phone. Her fingers moved with cold precision, dialing a number not saved in her contacts, a number she had memorized years ago for a contingency she never thought she would need. The voice that answered was bland, professional, and utterly discreet. "Yes," the man said without introduction. "I have a task for you," Eleanor stated, her voice as smooth and hard as glass. "It concerns my husband." She did not need to say his name. Everyone knew who her husband was. "I require a full accounting of his movements. Everything, especially his unscheduled activities." "Understood," the voice replied. "The usual retainer?" "Double it," Eleanor said, a bitter taste in her mouth. "I want results, and I want them yesterday. Be invisible. I will be in touch via a secure line." She ended the call before he could respond, placing the phone back down with a sharp click. The planning phase was over. Now came the hunt. The next afternoon, she feigned a headache, dismissing her usual driver. She told her head of staff, Mrs. Gable, that she required a complete day to herself, a rare shopping trip to the city alone. The lie felt flimsy, distasteful, but necessary. Control, she reminded herself, was about managing perceptions. Her perception, for today, was that of a bored wife seeking retail therapy. She drove her own sleek black coupe out of the estate's gates. She felt a strange sense of liberation mixed with dread. For the first time in years, she was operating outside the rigid structure of her life. 20 minutes later, she pulled into the parking garage of a high-end department store in a neighboring town, far from her usual haunts. She left her car and walked to a different level, where a nondescript gray sedan was waiting, engine idling. The man behind the wheel did not look at her as she slid into the passenger seat. He was in his 50s, with thinning hair and a forgettable face. He was a tool, nothing more. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Vance," he said, his eyes on the rearview mirror. "We have a preliminary trace. He left his downtown office 1 hour ago. He is not headed home." Eleanor said nothing. She simply stared out the window as the polished suburbs gave way to the older, more complex architecture of the city. The clean, wide avenues narrowed into streets lined with brick and stone. This was Julian's other world, the one built on shadows and whispers, the foundation upon which their pristine life at Blackwood Estate rested. She had never wanted to see it. She had been content in her gilded cage, believing she understood its dimensions. Now she knew the cage had a secret door, and someone else held the key. Her secure phone buzzed. A text message. One word. Mobile. The investigator followed Julian's car from a discreet distance, a dance of traffic and timing that was both nerve-wracking and strangely exhilarating. Eleanor's heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest. Part of her, a small, foolish part, prayed this would all lead to a secret business meeting, a clandestine deal with a rival. Something she could understand, something that fit into the world she knew. But the locket on her vanity told a different story. It promised a wound far deeper than business. The gray sedan finally came to a stop on a quiet cobblestone side street in the city's old quarter. The area was a maze of narrow alleyways and historic buildings, their lower floors converted into boutique shops and quiet bars. The investigator, whose name she had not bothered to ask, pointed a gloved finger. "He went in there," he said, his voice flat, "about 3 minutes ago." Eleanor looked. She saw nothing but a solid black door set into a dark brick wall. There was no sign, no name, just a small brass knocker in the shape of a songbird. It was anonymous, invisible to anyone not specifically looking for it. The sheer secrecy of it was more damning than any flashing neon sign could have been. This was a place meant to be hidden. This was his sanctuary. "Wait here," she commanded, her voice low. "Ma'am, it might not be safe," the investigator began. "I did not hire you for your opinion on my safety." She cut him off, her tone leaving no room for argument. She stepped out of the car. The air here smelled different. Damp stone, river water, and the faint, savory scent of food from a nearby restaurant. Her expensive heels clicked uncertainly on the uneven cobblestones, the sound unnervously loud in the quiet street. She felt exposed, a creature of light and order, trespassing in a realm of shadows. She reached the black door and hesitated for only a second. Her hand, steady now, reached for the brass bird. It was cool to the touch. She didn't knock. She turned the simple round handle below it. The door was unlocked. It swung inward with a soft, well-oiled sigh, opening into darkness. The change was immediate and total. The dim afternoon light was swallowed by an interior of profound shadow, pierced only by the soft glow of a few low-wattage table lamps. The air was thick with the rich, heady smells of aged whiskey, expensive cigar smoke, and something else. A sweet, cloying perfume that was not hers. From deeper within, she could hear the soulful, melancholic sound of a live jazz band. A saxophone wept a long, slow melody, underscored by the gentle rhythm of a brush on a snare drum and the deep, resonant throb of a double bass. Her eyes slowly adjusted. The place was a club, a small, intimate one. All dark wood paneling, deep red velvet booths, and polished brass fixtures that gleamed like old gold in the gloom. It was a world away from the cold marble and stark white spaces of her home. This place was warm, lived in, and steeped in secrets. She saw a bar along one wall, manned by a bartender who moved with quiet efficiency. A few patrons were scattered in the booths, their conversations a low, indistinct murmur beneath the music. A hostess, a young woman in a simple black dress, approached her. "Good afternoon. Do you have a reservation?" Eleanor's mind raced. She was an intruder. She didn't belong. But showing hesitation was a sign of weakness. She drew herself up, letting her natural aura of authority become her shield. "I'm meeting someone," she said, her voice cool and level. "I'd like a quiet table, in the back." The hostess seemed to recognize a certain type of clientele, one who valued privacy above all else. She nodded. "Of course, this way." She led Eleanor to a small, secluded booth in the far corner, partially obscured by a heavy velvet curtain. It offered a perfect, sweeping view of the main room, while keeping its occupant almost completely hidden. "Can I get you a drink?" the hostess asked. "A scotch," Eleanor said, naming the most expensive brand she could think of. "Neat." She needed the prop, something to hold on to. When the hostess left, Eleanor sank back into the plush velvet. She felt the vibrations of the bass through the floor, a slow, steady heartbeat for this secret world. Her eyes scanned the room methodically from left to right. She saw businessmen in expensive suits, their heads bent together in conspiratorial whispers. She saw a couple, older, holding hands under the table. And then she saw him, Julian. He was not in one of the main booths. He was at a small, private table near the stage. set slightly apart from the others. He was angled away from her, but she could see his profile, the sharp line of his the way his dark hair was perfectly styled. He wasn't wearing his usual armor of a severe black suit. He was in a soft, dark gray sweater, the sleeves pushed up to his elbows. He looked younger, less like a predator and more like a man, and he was not alone. Across from him sat Clara. The sight was a physical blow. It knocked the air from Eleanor's lungs. Clara was not wearing her drab maid's uniform. She had on a simple dark green dress that brought out the warmth in her skin and eyes. Her brown hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders. She looked beautiful. Not in the polished, severe way Eleanor was beautiful, but in a soft, natural way that seemed to radiate from within. Eleanor's hand tightened around the heavy crystal glass the waitress had placed before her. She could feel the sharp edges cutting into her palm. She watched, a silent, unseen judge in her dark corner, as the scene played out before her. This was not a clandestine, sordid meeting. It was something far, far worse. It was tender. Julian was leaning forward, his elbows on the table, his entire focus on Clara. He was listening to her speak, his head tilted slightly. As she talked, a small, genuine smile played on his lips. It was a smile Eleanor had seen perhaps twice in 10 years of marriage, and both times it had been a fleeting, public gesture. This was different. This was a smile that reached his intense gray eyes, softening them, filling them with a light she had never seen before. Clara finished what she was saying and laughed. It was not the timid, nervous sound Eleanor occasionally heard in the hallways of the estate. It was a full, joyous laugh, a sound that filled the small space between them. And Julian laughed with her, a low, warm chuckle that seemed to come from deep within his chest. The sound was so alien, so utterly out of character for the cold, controlled man she knew, that for a moment Eleanor wondered if she was hallucinating. Then he reached across the table and took her hand. It was not a formal gesture. He laced his fingers with hers, his thumb gently stroking the back of her hand. Clara's fingers tightened around his. They sat there, hands clasped on the dark wood, a perfect, unbroken circuit of intimacy. It was the most natural thing in the world, an everyday act of love between two people who belonged together. Eleanor felt a wave of nausea. This was not just an affair. This was a life, a whole separate life that Julian lived without her. This club, this music, this warmth, it all belonged to them. The Blackwood estate, with its cold marble and silent rooms, was the sham. This was the reality. She watched them for what felt like an eternity. Every small gesture was a new form of torture. She saw Julian lean in and murmur something in Clara's ear, his lips almost brushing her skin. She saw Clara blush, a lovely rose color spreading across her cheeks as she playfully swatted his arm. A gesture of such familiar affection, it made Eleanor's blood run cold. He was a different person with her. Open, vulnerable, happy. All the things he had never been, would never be, with his own wife. He looked at Clara with an expression that Eleanor could not at first name. She had seen him look at business rivals with contempt, at his subordinates with cool authority, at herself with a detached, polite indifference. This look was something else entirely. It was a look of profound, unguarded adoration. It was the way a man looks at the center of his universe. The realization hit Eleanor not as a thought, but as a deep physical certainty. He loved her. This wasn't about lust or a temporary distraction. Julian Thorne, her ruthless, untouchable husband, loved the maid. He loved the quiet, mousy girl who served them dinner and polished their silver. And it was an old love, a deep love. The faded photograph in the locket was not a memory of a past fling. It was the foundation of a present reality. On the stage, the band transitioned into another song. A female vocalist stepped up to the microphone, her voice a sultry, smoky whisper that curled through the room. She began to sing, a slow, heartbreaking ballad about a lost love. The lyrics drifted through the haze of smoke and secrets, finding their way directly to Eleanor's darkened booth. "They built me a house of glass and gold," the singer crooned, her eyes closed. "But every window showed a world so cold." Eleanor stared at Julian and Clara. They were lost in their own world, their heads close together, whispering. They didn't hear the music. They were the music. You were a ghost in every room I walked. The song continued, the saxophone crying out in agreement, a silent name in every word I talked. The scotch in her glass remained untouched. The ice had melted, watering down the expensive liquor, but she didn't notice. Her entire being was focused on the devastating tableau before her. She had built her life on a foundation of strength, control, and pride. She was Eleanor Vance. She did not cry. She did not break. She endured. But as she watched Julian gently tuck a stray strand of hair behind Clara's ear, a gesture of such simple, unconscious tenderness, something inside her finally fractured. The iron wall she had built around her heart for a decade cracked under the unbearable weight of this one simple truth. The singer's voice soared, filled with a raw, aching pain. And now you're here, my lonely, searching soul. You're the only home I've ever known. A single hot tear escaped her eye. It was not a tear of sadness. It was a tear of white-hot rage, of profound humiliation, of a heartbreak so complete it felt like a death. It traced a silent, burning path down her perfectly powdered cheek, a tiny flaw in an otherwise flawless facade. The jazz singer's lament filled the air, the beautiful, mournful sound, a perfect, mocking soundtrack to the silent, complete ruin of her world. The drive back to the Blackwood estate was a silent scream. The city's vibrant lights smeared past the windows, bleeding into meaningless streaks of neon and gold. Each flicker was a fresh stab of mockery, a reminder of the intimate, golden glow she had just witnessed in that dark club. The warmth she saw on Julian's face, a warmth reserved for Clara, had cauterized something inside of her. The jazz music she had heard, a soulful lament of lost love, now played on a loop in her mind, a soundtrack to her own private humiliation. Her knuckles were white on the leather steering wheel. The barf trujaspan the car, a fortress of steel and glass, felt fragile, as if the force of her rage alone could shatter it. In her designer handbag, Clara's silver locket felt less like jewelry and more like a shard of ice, a cold, hard piece of the truth she could not escape. She swept through the grand entrance of the estate, the heavy oak door closing behind her with a definitive boom that echoed in the cavernous hall. The house was silent. It was always silent, but tonight the quiet was different. It was not the peaceful silence of order, but the heavy, waiting silence of a tomb. The air, usually crisp with the scent of lemon polish and expensive, scentless lilies, felt thick and stagnant. Her heels clicked sharply on the marble floor, each step a tiny, angry report. She did not turn toward her own wing, a suite of rooms that felt more like a showroom than a home. She walked with unnerving purpose toward Julian's office, his private sanctuary, the one room she was implicitly forbidden from entering. It was the heart of his empire, the place where fortunes were made and lives were decided with a quiet phone call. The door, carved from dark, heavy wood, was slightly ajar. She pushed it open. The room smelled of him, an intoxicating and now repulsive mix of aged leather, old paper, and the clean metallic scent of power. It was here. This was the ground where she would make her stand. She walked to the vast, floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the long, winding driveway. The moon cast a pale, sickly light over the perfectly manicured lawns. She stood there, a statue carved from fury, clutching the locket in her fist, its edges digging into her palm. She waited. An hour passed, or maybe it was a lifetime. Time had dissolved into a slow, agonizing drip. Then finally a pair of headlights cut through the darkness, sweeping across the grounds like searchlights. Julian was home. A painful, violent tremor went through her. This was it. She heard the distant crunch of tires on gravel, the solid thud of a car door, and then the sound of his measured, confident footsteps crossing the marble in the hall. The steps paused outside the office door. He knew. He had to have sensed her presence, a disruption in the perfect cold order of his world. The door swung open fully. Julian stood there, framed in the doorway, a dark silhouette against the softer light of the hall. His black suit was, as always, immaculate. Not a single strand of his dark hair was out of place. He looked at her, his intense gray eyes taking in the scene. He showed no surprise, only a deep, unnerving stillness. It was the calm of a predator assessing a change in its environment. "Eleanor," he said, his voice was low and even, betraying nothing. It was not a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of her presence, a demand for an explanation. She did not give him one, not with words. Her rage had burned away all the pleasantries, all the carefully constructed phrases she had rehearsed. All that was left was a raw, primal need to make him see, to make him feel even a fraction of the chasm that had opened up beneath her feet. She walked toward the enormous mahogany desk that served as the altar of his power. Her movements were stiff, her body a tightly coiled spring. When she reached it, she opened her hand and with a force that surprised even herself, slammed the small silver locket down onto the polished surface. The sound was shockingly loud, a sharp metallic clatter that fractured the oppressive silence. The tarnished heart skittered across the wood, coming to a rest beside a neat stack of files bound in black leather. Julian's gaze dropped from her face to the locket. Then it returned to her. In that fleeting moment, she searched his eyes for any sign of guilt, of panic, of regret. There was nothing. His expression remained a mask of cold control. He knew exactly what it was. He had known the second he saw it. This was not a discovery for him. It was merely an inconvenience. Slowly, he walked around the desk and picked it up. He did not need to open it. He cradled the cheap piece of metal in his palm as if it were a precious gem. Her voice, when it finally came, was a ragged, broken thing. "Explain this," she whispered, the words tearing at her throat. "Explain what this is." He finally looked at her, his eyes holding hers without a trace of remorse. "It belongs to Clara," he said, his tone simple and direct. The words were not an apology. They were a statement of fact. A wave of dizziness washed over Eleanor. The sheer, unmitigated gall of it stole her breath. "I know whose it is," she managed to say, her voice gaining a sharp, brittle edge. "I am asking you why. Why is she here? Why is her token in my house with my husband?" The word husband felt foreign and absurd on her tongue. Julian placed the locket back on the desk with deliberate care, aligning it perfectly with the edge of his leather blotter. "Eleanor," he began, and the placid, condescending tone sent a fresh wave of fury through her. "My life with you is one thing. My life outside of that is another. The two do not intersect." "Do not intersect?" she repeated, her voice rising with disbelief. "She lives here. She serves me my coffee. She cleans my rooms. She walks through my home wearing a symbol of her affair with you. How dare you tell me they do not intersect?" "Our marriage is an arrangement," he continued, completely unmoved by her outburst. He spoke as if explaining a complex business deal to a child. "It is an alliance between two influential families. It has been mutually beneficial. You have a life of comfort, of status, of absolute security under my name. You want for nothing." He gestured vaguely around the opulent room, at the priceless art on the walls, at the view of the sprawling estate. "This is your part of the bargain. I expect you to uphold it." The coldness of his words was more painful than any physical blow. He wasn't just admitting to the affair. He was justifying it, framing it as his right. He was telling her that her feelings were irrelevant, an emotional overstep in a purely transactional relationship. He saw her not as a wife, not even as a woman, but as an asset that was suddenly malfunctioning. "So I am a transaction," she said, the words hollow. Tears of pure rage and humiliation burned at the back of her eyes, but she would not let them fall. Not in front of him. "And what is she? What is that little maid to you?" For the first time, a flicker of something crossed his face. It was not guilt. It was something deeper, something fiercely protective. "She is not part of this discussion," he said, his voice hardening. "She has nothing to do with you or our arrangement." "She has everything to do with me," Eleanor finally screamed, the sound ripping from her chest. "She lives in my home, sleeps under my roof, and shares my husband. You have made a fool of me, Julian." "No one has made a fool of you," he countered, his voice dropping back to that icy calm. "Our life is a performance, Eleanor. We both know that. You play your part, I play mine. All I am asking is that you continue to play your part. Accept it. Nothing has to change. Accept it. The words hung in the air between them, an insult of such magnitude that she felt her entire body go cold. He expected her to silently tolerate this humiliation, to wake up every morning and be served by the woman he loved, to smile and host parties and pretend her world hadn't been shattered, to be a willing accomplice in her own degradation. A dark, venomous thought took root in the ruins of her heart. If he would not grant her dignity, perhaps she could take something from him, the only thing he seemed to value. That girl, she said, her voice dropping to a low, menacing pitch that mirrored his own. That quiet little nobody. I want her gone. By morning. I will not have her in my sight. Throw her back to whatever gutter you dredged her up from, or I will do it myself. The change in him was instantaneous and terrifying. The cold, detached businessman vanished. In his place stood the man whispered about in dark rooms, the man who commanded fear with a glance. He moved from behind the desk with a speed and silence that was predatory. In 2 long strides, he closed the space between them, his presence overwhelming her. The air grew thick, electric with a palpable threat. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. His voice was no longer calm. It was a deadly, chilling whisper that promised absolute ruin. Listen to me, Eleanor, he breathed, his gray eyes now dark as storm clouds. And listen very carefully. You will not touch her. You will not speak a word to her that is not required by her duties. You will not give her so much as a disapproving look. He paused, his gaze boring into her, stripping away every layer of her pride. If you cause her a moment's distress, if I learn that you have laid a hand on her or harmed her in any way, I will not just end our marriage. His voice dropped even lower, becoming a thread of pure ice. I will dismantle your life, piece by piece. Your family's reputation will be ash. The comfort you take for granted will be a distant memory. I will personally burn down everything you and your father have ever built. Do you understand me? He was so close she could feel the cold fury radiating from him. This was not a bluff, it was a vow. He leaned in, his lips almost brushing her ear. Clara is under my protection, he whispered, the words a final, devastating blow. You are not. He straightened up, his face once again an impassive mask, but his eyes held the lingering storm. He turned his back on her, dismissing her as if she were no more than a disobedient servant. He walked back to his desk, picked up the tarnished silver locket, and closed his fist around it. His thumb began to stroke the metal, a gesture of absent-minded tenderness that was more damning than any confession. Eleanor stood frozen in the center of the room. The echo of his threat was a physical presence, wrapping around her, suffocating her. He had not just chosen another woman. He had chosen to protect that woman from her. In her own home. The locket was on his desk. She was the one being thrown out, not emotionally, but existentially. In the kingdom she had believed she ruled, she had just been shown her true place. She was not the queen. She was not even a pawn. She was the wall, built to protect the real treasure inside, and she had just been warned never to cross it. The silence in the aftermath of Julian's threat was worse than his words. It was a physical presence in his office, a cold weight pressing down on Eleanor. His voice, that deadly whisper, still coiled in the air long after he had gone. He had not apologized. He had not explained. He had drawn a line in the sand, and she stood on the wrong side of it, alone with a tarnished silver locket on a vast mahogany desk. For a long moment, Eleanor did not move. Her blood was ice. The rage that had carried her into this room had evaporated, leaving behind a brittle, hollow shell. She had expected a fight, tears, perhaps even a negotiation. She had not expected to be dismissed, to be warned, to be told in no uncertain terms that her pain was an inconvenience. She slowly picked up the locket. It was warm now from her own body heat, a sickening contrast to the chill that had settled deep in her bones. This was not about a cheap affair. This was about loyalty. And Julian, her husband, the man whose name she carried like a shield, had given his loyalty to a ghost who polished her silver. A woman named Clara. The name itself felt like an insult, simple, plain, a name that belonged in the background, not at the center of her husband's world. The humiliation was a physical ache, a tightness in her chest that made it hard to breathe. But beneath the pain, something else was taking root. A cold, quiet resolve. If she was not his wife, not in any way that mattered, then what was she? And more importantly, who was Clara Rossi? Eleanor did not sleep that night, or the night after. She moved through the cold, silent rooms of Blackwood Estate like a specter, the house itself now feeling like a foreign country. She watched Clara from a distance. She saw the way the girl's shoulders were always slightly hunched, her eyes always downcast. She saw the practiced meekness, the careful way she made herself smaller, invisible. It was a perfect performance. Too perfect. This was not the demeanor of a woman having a triumphant affair with the master of the house. This was the posture of a hunted animal. Eleanor had spent her life learning to read people, to find the subtle tells in their posture, the flicker of fear in their eyes. She had used it to maintain control at charity galas and board meetings. Now she turned that piercing gaze onto the maid who served her tea. She no longer cared about the betrayal. That was a simple, ugly wound. What she cared about now was the mystery. The lie was not that Julian was with another woman. The lie was her entire life. She retreated to her private study, a room Julian never entered, and locked the door. She didn't use the private investigator she had hired before. He was a man for uncovering sordid, simple truths. This required a different kind of tool. She made a call to a number she had not dialed in years, a number connected to the shadowy foundations of her own family's power. The man on the other end did not ask questions. He listened to her calm, precise request. Find everything there is to know about a woman named Clara Rossi, and find everything connected to her family. The information came not in a manila envelope, but in encrypted digital files that trickled into her secure inbox over the next 72 hours. Eleanor sat in the dark, the only light coming from the cool glow of her laptop screen. She pieced together a life from fragments. A birth certificate from a small-town hospital. School records showing average grades. A series of addresses, each one more transient than the last. There were no social media profiles, no digital footprints, no life lived online. Clara Rossi was a ghost long before she came to Blackwood Estate. Eleanor felt a flicker of something, not pity, but a strange professional respect. It took effort to be this invisible. Then she found it. It was not a police report, but a small article from a local newspaper, dated 15 years ago. The headline was mundane. Fire claims lives of local business owners. The article detailed a tragic fire at the home of Marco and Isabella Rossi. It mentioned their small but respected import business. It mentioned they were survived by a single daughter, a teenager named Clara, who was not home at the time. An accident, the fire marshal had ruled. Faulty wiring, case closed. But Eleanor's eyes were fixed on a different detail, a single paragraph near the end. It mentioned that the Rossi family had recently been in a dispute with a larger competitor seeking to acquire their roots. The competitor was a company owned by the Falcone family. Falcone. The name struck Eleanor like a physical blow. The Falcones were not just competitors. They were the old dynasty, the rivals Julian's family had systematically dismantled. Julian's ruthless ascent had begun right after the Falcones were broken, scattered to the winds. And it all started, she now realized, right around the time of that accidental fire. Her fingers went cold on the keyboard. She pulled up another set of files, this time on Julian. His timeline, his known associates. His first significant move against the Falcone empire happened just 3 months after the fire that killed Clara's parents. It wasn't business, it was a vendetta. She leaned back in her chair, the screensaver casting shifting patterns on her face. The puzzle was complete. The locket was not a souvenir from a recent affair. It was a relic, a promise. Julian and Clara were not a new development. They were the original story, the one that had been playing out long before Eleanor ever entered the picture. The warmth Julian showed Clara was not the heat of a new romance. It was the enduring warmth of a shared history, a shared tragedy. He wasn't her lover. He was her protector, her avenger. The wave of emotion that washed over Eleanor was not what she would have expected. The sharp sting of betrayal was gone. In its place was a vast, empty coldness, a humiliation so profound it was almost clarifying. She had been angry that Julian had chosen a maid over her, but he had never chosen a maid. He had chosen the girl whose family was destroyed, the girl he swore to keep safe. The maid uniform, the servants' quarters, the life of quiet servitude, it was all a costume. The most brilliant hiding place in the world. Who would ever look for a mafia boss's most precious secret scrubbing his floors? Who would suspect the meek, invisible girl was the entire reason for his war? Eleanor felt a bitter laugh rise in her throat. She had pitied Clara. She had despised her. But she had never once imagined that Clara was the one with all the power. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the perfectly manicured lawns of her prison. She had believed this house, this life, was the prize. She thought her marriage was a contract of power, and that she held half of it. She was wrong. The marriage was not a contract. It was camouflage. Her presence, her name, her respectable family, they were all just part of the disguise. She was the beard, the perfect high society cover story for a man waging a 15-year war for the ghost of a girl he loved. She knew what she had to do. This was not a conversation for Julian. He had already made his position clear. This was a conversation for Clara. Eleanor left the study and walked through the silent house. The scent of lemon polish and wilting roses seemed to mock her. She found Clara in the main hall, carefully dusting a large, ornate mirror. The girl was so focused on her task, she didn't hear Eleanor approach. In the reflection, Eleanor could see both of their faces. Her own, pale and severe, and Clara's, framed by loose strands of brown hair, her expression one of quiet concentration. "Clara," Eleanor said. Her voice was perfectly level, devoid of any emotion. Clara jumped, a small gasp escaping her lips. She turned, her hands immediately clasping in front of her, her eyes dropping to the floor. "Mrs. Vance, I am sorry, I did not hear you." "Leave that," Eleanor said, gesturing vaguely at the dustcloth. "Come with me." She did not lead her to the formal living room or Julian's office. She led her to the kitchen. It was a vast, sterile space of white marble and stainless steel. It was a room for work, not for conversation. It was cold, bright, and there was nowhere to hide. Eleanor sat at the large central island, her posture ramrod straight. She gestured for Clara to sit opposite her. Clara hesitated, her eyes wide with fear. A maid did not sit in the presence of the lady of the house, certainly not at the main island. "Sit down, Clara," Eleanor repeated. The command was soft, but it held the unbreakable strength of forged steel. Clara slowly, hesitantly, perched on the edge of a stool. She looked like a frightened bird, ready to fly at the slightest sound. She was probably expecting to be fired, to be screamed at, to be thrown out onto the street. Eleanor let the silence stretch, watching the fear build in Clara's eyes. She wanted her afraid. She needed her off balance. Finally, Eleanor spoke. Her voice was as cold and clean as the marble countertop. "I am not going to ask you about my husband," she began. "We are past that." Clara flinched but said nothing. "I'm going to ask you about your parents," Eleanor continued. "Marco and Isabella Rossi. Tell me about them." The effect was instantaneous and devastating. All the color drained from Clara's face. Her practiced meekness shattered like glass. Her head snapped up, her eyes locking with Eleanor's, and for the first time Eleanor saw not a servant, but a terrified young woman staring at a ghost. Tears welled instantly, spilling down her cheeks. Her breath hitched in a tone she tried desperately to suppress. How do you know their names?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "I know a great many things," Eleanor said, her tone unchanged. "I know they owned an import business. I know they died in a fire 15 years ago, a fire that was ruled an accident. But it wasn't an accident, was it, Clara?" Clara began to tremble, her hands shaking so hard she hid them in her lap. She shook her head, tears now flowing freely. "Please," she choked out, "please don't." "Don't what?" Eleanor pressed, her gaze unyielding. "Don't talk about the Falcone family? Don't talk about why a promising young man named Julian Thorne suddenly decided to dedicate his life to destroying them? Your history is all over my house, Clara. I just never knew how to read it until now." That broke her. A ragged sob tore from Clara's throat, and she finally let go. The story came tumbling out, disjointed and raw, filled with the kind of pain that never heals. She spoke of a happy childhood, of her father's pride in his small business. She spoke of Julian, not as a fearsome mafia boss, but as a boy who used to climb the tree outside her window. Their families were not just associates, they were friends. Then the Falcones came. They wanted her father's shipping routes. He was a proud man. He refused. Clara's voice dropped to a barely audible whisper as she described the night of the fire. She wasn't supposed to be out. She had snuck out to meet Julian. When she came back, the sky was orange. The smell of smoke was everywhere. She described the heat, the screams she heard in her own mind. She hid in the woods behind the house, paralyzed by terror. And then Julian found her. He was just a boy himself, but his face was something else, something hard and terrible. He pulled her from the bushes, covered her in his own jacket, and made her a promise. He promised her they would pay, and he promised he would keep her safe, forever. She explained the lost years that followed, how Julian had hidden her with distant relatives in boarding schools under false names, always moving her the moment he sensed danger. He built his empire brick by bloody brick, all of it a fortress to protect her. But his enemies grew with his power. There was nowhere left to hide her, no place they would not look. So he brought you here, Eleanor finished for her, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. He hid you in the one place no one would ever think to search, in plain sight. Servant. Clara nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. He said it was the only way, to be near, to watch over me. If anyone knew who I was, if his enemies knew how much She trailed off, unable to say the words. How much I mean to him. The words hung in the sterile air of the kitchen. Eleanor stared at the weeping girl. The affair was a lie. The whole thing was a lie. It was a tragedy, a love story, a 15-year quest for revenge and protection. And she, Eleanor Vance, the powerful, pedigreed wife, was nothing more than a piece of the architecture. A decorative gargoyle on the fortress Julian had built around his real treasure. Her marriage, the society events, the illusion of a normal life, it was all a shield for Clara. She felt a strange detachment, as if she were watching a scene from a movie. The pain was so immense it had become abstract. She was not a wife who had been cheated on. She was a fool who had never even been in the game. She had been guarding an empty throne room, polishing a crown that was never meant for her. Her life at Blackwood Estate was a beautifully constructed, hollow performance. Clara's quiet sobs were the only sound in the room. Eleanor pushed her stool back and stood up. She looked past the girl, at her own reflection in the polished chrome of a refrigerator door. She saw a woman with perfect hair, an expensive silk blouse, and eyes that were completely, utterly empty. The queen was a ghost, the servant was the prize, and she was the cage that kept them both safe. Eleanor realized she was never the queen in a loveless marriage, but merely a placeholder, a shield in a much older, more dangerous game. The silence in the days that followed was a living thing. It settled over the cold marble floors of the Blackwood Estate like a fine layer of dust, muffling every footstep, swallowing every breath. Eleanor moved through the vast, empty rooms, a ghost in her own home. She had been a queen in a gilded cage. Now she knew she was not even the queen. She was the cage itself, an elaborate, expensive structure built to protect Julian's real treasure. Her marriage, her life, her very presence was a functional lie, a shield. She watched Clara now with a strange, unnerving detachment. The burning jealousy had cooled into something far more dangerous, analysis. She saw the way the girl's hands would still when Julian entered a room, the slight, almost imperceptible tilt of her head toward the sound of his voice. These were not the actions of a timid maid carrying on a sordid affair. They were the ingrained reflexes of a life lived in orbit of a single sun. The hatred Eleanor had felt was a passionate human emotion. This new feeling was cold, clear, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the feeling of a strategist observing an opponent's key piece on a chessboard. Clara was dusting the grand piano in the music room, her movements small and efficient. She kept her eyes down as always. But Eleanor saw the tension in her shoulders, the way she held her body as if waiting for a blow that never came. The girl was afraid of her. Eleanor almost laughed. Fear was a useless emotion now. It was a luxury for people who still had something to lose. Eleanor had already lost the one thing she never truly had. All that remained was the truth, sharp and ugly and strangely liberating. She was a placeholder in a story that began long before her and would continue long after her. That evening, the silence finally broke. It did not break with a word or a confession. It shattered violently and completely with the sound of the floor-to-ceiling windows in the main hall exploding inward. A cascade of glass sprayed across the polished marble, glittering like deadly diamonds under the chandeliers. The sound was followed instantly by another. A dry, percussive crack that echoed through the house. A sound Eleanor knew only from films but recognized with chilling primal certainty. Gunfire. She was in the library, a cavern of dark wood and the scent of old paper. Julian was there, standing by the unlit fireplace, his back to her as he spoke quietly on his phone. Clara had just entered with a silver tray, carrying a decanter of whiskey in a single glass. The three of them, a perfect, miserable triangle, frozen for a heartbeat by the sudden violence. Julian's body went rigid. The phone clattered to the floor. His head snapped up, his gray eyes instantly losing all trace of civility and becoming chips of ice. "Down," he snarled, his voice a low command that cut through the rising chaos. Outside the library, shouts and more gunfire erupted. The sounds of a well-oiled machine, his security detail, meeting an invading force. A heavy oak door to the library burst open. A man stood there, dressed in black, a weapon held firmly in his hands. His eyes were wide, wired, and they swept the room, landing on the tableau of the Mafia boss, his wife, and the maid. For a split second, the gunman seemed unsure, his weapon wavering between the two women who stood mere feet apart. Eleanor saw the choice happen before it was even made. It was not a thought. It was an instinct. Julian's entire being, every muscle, every ounce of his formidable presence, moved with a singular, undeniable purpose. "Clara!" He didn't shout her name. He breathed it. It was a prayer. In one fluid, powerful motion, he launched himself across the small space separating them. He collided with Clara, wrapping his arms around her and driving her down behind the heavy mahogany desk, his own body covering hers completely. A perfect human shield. And Eleanor was left alone. She stood in the center of the room, utterly exposed. The gunman's momentary indecision vanished. His target was now clear. The barrel of his gun swung towards her. The world seemed to slow, the sounds of the firefight outside fading into a dull roar. She saw the dark, empty circle of the muzzle. She saw the man's finger tighten on the trigger. She saw her husband's back, turn to her a solid wall of protection for someone else. In that moment, a strange and terrible peace washed over her. The final illusion was gone, burned away by the raw, undeniable truth of Julian's actions. There was no pain, no heartbreak, just the cold, hard fact of her own expendability. She was not even a secondary concern. She was an afterthought, a liability left to fend for herself. She felt a flicker of something she almost mistook for amusement. All her life she had been taught that her name, her bloodline, her marriage to Julian Thorne made her untouchable. It was the greatest lie of all. But as she stared down the barrel of the gun, another man burst through a connecting door from the conservatory, his movements stealthy and practiced. He was flanking them. He raised his own weapon, not at her, but at the one target whose death would mean victory. He aimed directly at Julian's unprotected back. No one saw him. Julian was focused on Clara. His men were engaged in the halls, and the first gunman was focused on her. Only Eleanor saw the new threat. Only Eleanor saw the clean, unobstructed line of fire. Something inside her shifted. It was not love that moved her. It was not forgiveness. It was a cold, primal instinct that had been bred into her bones, a trait from her own ruthless family that she had never needed to use. The Vance legacy was not just in society columns and charity balls. It was in hostile takeovers and broken rivals. It was the instinct to protect one's assets, to eliminate a threat to the foundation of her entire world. Julian Thorne, for all his betrayal, was the pillar holding up the name, the wealth, the power she possessed. His fall would be her fall. This was not about saving her husband. This was about saving her empire. Her eyes, sharp and calculating, darted to the side. On the edge of the massive desk where Julian conducted his dark business lay a decorative letter opener. It was heavy, sterling silver, with an ornate handle and a wickedly sharp point, a gift she had given him for their second anniversary, a cold, impersonal object for a cold, impersonal marriage. It was meant for slitting open envelopes containing contracts and formal invitations. She moved. There was no grace in her movement. It was a sudden, violent lurch. Her silk dress tore at the seam as she lunged for the desk. Her hand, the one that had only ever been taught to hold a champagne flute or a pen to sign a check, closed around the cold, heavy handle of the letter opener. The weight of it was unfamiliar but solid. Right. She did not scream. She did not cry out a warning. She held the silver weapon low and tight against her body, her knuckles white. She ignored the man aiming at her and threw herself forward. Her target, the second gunman, the one who threatened the center of her universe. He was just bringing his weapon to bear, his focus entirely on Julian's back. He never saw her coming. Eleanor slammed into him from the side, a whirlwind of desperation and dormant fury. The man grunted, surprised by the sudden impact. She was taller than him, and she used her height, bringing her arm up and then down with all of her weight behind it. The point of the silver letter opener found its mark. It plunged into the soft tissue of the man's shoulder, just below the collarbone. The sound was not a clean slice, but a sickening, dull thud of metal hitting flesh and bone. A hot, wet spray hit her hand. The man's eyes went wide with shock and agony. A strangled cry escaped his lips. His arm went limp, the fingers of his hand uncurling as the gun fell from his grasp. It hit the thick Persian rug with a soft, heavy thud. He staggered back, clutching his shoulder, his face a mask of disbelief as he stared at the impeccably dressed woman who had just disabled him. The first gunman, startled by the sudden commotion, turned his head for a fatal second. That was all one of Julian's men needed. A shot rang out from the hallway, and the man who had been about to end Eleanor's life crumpled to the floor without a sound. Silence descended upon the library. It was a thick, heavy quiet, punctuated by the ragged sound of breathing and the distant, fading echo of the last gunshot. The air was acrid with the smell of cordite and something else, something coppery and metallic. The room was a disaster. Books were splayed on the floor, a porcelain lamp was shattered, and dark stains were beginning to spread across the expensive rug. Julian slowly, cautiously pushed himself up. He helped a trembling Clara to her feet, his hand still on her, his eyes scanning her for any injury. "Are you all right?" he murmured, his voice rough with adrenaline. Clara could only nod, her face buried in his chest, her body shaking uncontrollably. Only when he was certain she was unharmed did Julian finally turn. His gaze swept the room, taking in the scene. He saw the first gunman lying still by the door. Then he saw the second, groaning on the floor, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his weapon lying uselessly beside him. And then his eyes found Eleanor. She was standing over the wounded man, her chest rising and falling with sharp, deep breaths. Her blonde hair, usually pinned into a perfect, severe chignon, had come partially undone, soft strands framing a face that was pale and smudged with dirt. Her blue dress was torn. Her hand was still clenched around the silver letter opener. The ornate handle was slick and dark, and a single perfect drop of blood slid down the polished blade to tremble at its point before falling onto the carpet. Her face held no fear, no tears, no shock. Her blue eyes, usually so cold and dismissive, were now blazing with a terrifying, focused intensity. She looked like a Valkyrie, standing over a fallen enemy on a battlefield. Julian stared. He looked from the incapacitated man on the floor to the weapon in her hand and back to her face. He saw everything in that single frozen moment. He saw that she had been left exposed. He saw that a man had been about to shoot him in the back. And he saw that his wife, the woman he had dismissed as a fragile, decorative piece of their arrangement, had saved his life. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. What could he say? Thank you? Sorry I left you to die. He had seen her as a porcelain doll, beautiful, cold, and easily broken. He had been wrong, so profoundly, dangerously wrong. In the bloody, chaotic aftermath of the attack, Julian Thorne looked at his wife, Eleanor Vance. He did not see a woman to love. He did not see a partner to cherish. He saw for the very first time an equal. His gaze held no affection. It held no warmth. It held something far more potent, a deep, staggering shock, and the dawning, grudging respect one predator gives to another. He had underestimated her completely, and the knowledge of that mistake was a more terrifying realization than any bullet. The silence that fell after the last gunshot was a different kind of quiet. It was not the cold, sterile silence of the Blackwood estate that Eleanor knew. This was a heavy, wounded silence, thick with the metallic scent of cordite and the dust of shattered plaster. Julian's men moved through the grand hall like shadows, their voices low and urgent, but to Eleanor they were a world away. She stood near the ruined mahogany desk, her breathing even, her hands steady at her sides. The letter opener she had used felt strangely light in her memory, an extension of a will she never knew she possessed. Julian was staring at her. Across the room, amidst the debris of what was once a perfect, lifeless showroom, he looked at his wife. For the first time, he truly saw her. It was not admiration in his gaze, and it was certainly not love. It was the shocked, grudging respect a predator gives another, an acknowledgement of teeth where he had only seen polished smiles. He had underestimated her completely. He thought he had married a beautiful piece of art to hang on his wall, and he had just discovered it was a loaded weapon. Clara was at his side, her small hand clutching his arm, her eyes wide with a fear that seemed to belong to another life, another woman. Eleanor met his stare for a single long moment. The chasm between them was no longer filled with her silent, aching questions. It was now filled with the cold, clear truth. She felt nothing, not rage, not heartbreak, not even the bitter satisfaction of being proven right. It was as if the violence had cauterized a wound that had been festering for years, leaving behind only a clean, numb scar. She turned without a word and walked away from him, her heels clicking softly on the marble floor, a sound that cut through the muffled chaos. She did not look at the broken vases or the bullet holes peppering the walls. They were just damages to a property that was no longer hers. She ascended the grand staircase, her posture as straight and unyielding as ever. Her hand did not tremble as it rested on the cool, smooth balustrade. Each step was a deliberate move away from the woman she had been, the woman who arranged flowers that would only wilt, the woman who set a table for a husband who never truly came home, the woman who measured her worth by the silent approval of a man who loved someone else. That woman had died tonight, somewhere between the first gunshot and the moment she chose to fight back. In her bedroom, the scene was untouched, an island of pristine order in a sea of destruction. She walked directly to her closet, a vast walk-in space that was more like a boutique. Rows upon rows of designer dresses hung like silent soldiers. Shelves of shoes were arranged by color and style. Handbags, each a small fortune, sat on display. This was her armor, the uniform of Mrs. Eleanor Thorne. She ran her fingers lightly over the sleeve of a silk blouse, the fabric cool and impersonal. She remembered the day she bought it, the fleeting sense of power it gave her, a power that was borrowed, fragile, and utterly fake. She turned away from it all. On the large, perfectly made bed, she placed a single, small suitcase of dark leather. It was the one she used for short, solo trips to visit her parents, a practical piece she'd owned in for years. She opened it. She bypassed the closet entirely and went to her drawers. She packed 3 sets of simple black trousers and cream-colored cashmere sweaters. She packed plain undergarments, socks, and a pair of flat, comfortable leather shoes. She took 1 small bag of essential toiletries, leaving the dozens of expensive perfumes and creams on her vanity. Her movements were calm and efficient. It was not an act of frantic escape. It was a careful and conscious dismantling of a life. Her inner voice was quiet, a steady hum beneath the surface of her actions. She saw the woman who had lived here, a ghost who flitted between these beautiful empty rooms. A woman who had cried silently into a silk pillowcase after watching her husband laugh with another woman. A woman who had felt a shard of ice in her heart when he had warned her not to harm Clara. That woman was weak, pathetic, but she was also the foundation upon which this new Eleanor was built. The pain had been the pressure, and the pressure had finally created something unbreakable. She went to the small safe hidden behind a painting. Inside were not jewels. Her jewelry was in a larger vault downstairs, a vault she would not be visiting. This small safe held her life, her original birth certificate, her passport, a portfolio of personal investments her father had insisted she maintain separately before the wedding, and a slim, leather-bound folder. She took the folder and her passport, placing them carefully inside the suitcase. Then she walked to her personal study, connected to the bedroom. She sat at her desk, opened her laptop, and made a single phone call. The line picked up on the second ring. "Arthur," she said, her voice clear and steady. "It's Eleanor Thorne." There was a pause on the other end. "Eleanor, are you all right? We heard news of some trouble at the estate." Arthur Davies had been her family's lawyer for 30 years. His voice was laced with genuine concern. "I'm fine, Arthur. In fact, I've never been better." She looked out the window at the dark, manicured lawns, now swarming with Julian's men. "I need you to listen very carefully. I am invoking the Vance Protocol, specifically Clause 17, subsection B of the marriage contract." The line went silent for a few seconds. "17B," Arthur repeated, his voice now stripped of its warmth, replaced by sharp professionalism. "Eleanor, that clause is absolute. It requires irrefutable proof of a material breach." "I have it," Eleanor stated simply. "Adultery, for one. I have names, dates, and locations. But more importantly, as of tonight, there has been a fundamental breach of contract regarding my personal safety. The estate, my home, was compromised by my husband's enemies. That is a failure of his duties as stipulated in Section 9. It is a direct threat to the Vance family interests through me. Is that not correct?" "Yes," Arthur said slowly. "Technically, it is. It's an aggressive interpretation, but it's sound." "Then be aggressive," Eleanor commanded. "I want the asset transfer initiated immediately. The holdings, the shares in the transport company, the offshore accounts designated under that clause. Everything. I want it liquid and under my sole control by morning. Julian will be distracted. Now is the time to move." "It will be done," the lawyer said. There was a note of admiration in his tone. "Your father would be proud, Eleanor. He always said you had a mind for this." "My father thought I needed protecting," she replied, a faint, bitter smile touching her lips for a second. "He was wrong." She ended the call and closed the laptop. She stood up, feeling a lightness she hadn't experienced in a decade. She was not just a woman leaving her husband. She was a general executing a flawless tactical withdrawal, taking her spoils with her. She closed the suitcase. The clasp clicked shut with two sharp final sounds. She took one last look around the room. The bed was still perfect. The closets were still full. It looked as if no one had been there at all. That was fitting. The woman who lived here was an illusion, and she was finally leaving no trace. Carrying the single suitcase, she walked back out to the landing of the grand staircase. The main hall was quieter now. The broken glass had been swept into piles. Julian's most trusted men stood in a loose circle, speaking with him, and beside him still was Clara. She was no longer crying, but her face was pale, and she looked small and lost in the cavernous space. Julian saw Eleanor first. He stopped talking, and the other men turned to follow his gaze. The world seemed to slow down. Julian stood tall, his dark suit immaculate despite the night's events. His expression was a complex mask of exhaustion, fury, and that same unsettling respect. He watched her descend, step by step, as if she were a queen descending from her throne for the last time. Clara watched her too, her brown eyes filled with a mixture of fear and something else. Guilt, perhaps, or maybe just confusion. Eleanor's path would take her directly past them on her way to the front door. She did not alter her course. Her gaze was fixed on the heavy oak doors that led to her freedom. As she drew level with them, Julian finally spoke her name. "Eleanor." His voice was low, rough with the smoke and stress of the night. It was a command, a question, and a plea all in one. He had never used that tone with her before. It was the voice of a man who had lost control and was trying to reclaim it. She stopped. She did not turn her head fully, but angled it just enough to see him in her periphery. She saw Clara flinch at his side, as if expecting an explosion. Eleanor felt a strange, detached pity for the girl. Clara had won her prize. She had Julian's love, his protection, and with it, She had inherited a lifetime of looking over her shoulder, of living in the shadow of his violence, of being a target. She was a bird in a beautiful, dangerous cage, and she did not even know it. Don't, Eleanor said. Her voice was not loud, but it was absolute. It carried across the hall a blade of pure, cold steel. It was not a request. It was an order. She was not his wife to be placated. She was not his victim to be managed. She looked at him then fully. She let him see her eyes. They were not filled with tears or hatred. They were empty of him. That was the greatest blow she could ever deliver. He could withstand her anger, her hysterics, her revenge. He was a man built for conflict. But her utter indifference, her complete and total erasure of him from her world, he had no defense against that. His face tightened, the scar above his eyebrow stark against his pale skin. He understood. He had not broken her heart. He had forged it into something he could no longer touch. She gave Clara a final fleeting glance. The maid who had served her tea, polished her silver, and slept with her husband. The girl who was the center of a great, tragic love story. In Eleanor's own story, she was now just a minor character. A catalyst. Nothing more. Then Eleanor turned and continued her walk to the door. Her suitcase felt weightless. Julian did not try to stop her again. His men, loyal and dangerous, parted for her as if she were royalty. They recognized power when they saw it, and it was radiating from her in waves. She reached the front door. One of Julian's men, a man named Thomas, who had always been polite to her, moved to open it. She held up a hand, a small, subtle gesture. He stopped. She would open her own door. She placed her hand on the cold brass handle, the same handle Julian touched every night when he came home to a life he did not want. She pushed. The heavy door swung open, and the cool night air washed over her. It smelled of rain and damp earth, clean and real. Beyond the stone portico, a discreet black sedan was waiting, its engine humming quietly. Her car, her future. She stepped across the threshold, from the cold, artificial light of the mansion into the deep, honest dark of the night. She did not look back. There was no need. The Blackwood estate, with its marble floors and broken crystal, was a tomb. Julian Thorne, the powerful Mafia boss, and Clara Rossi, his one true love, were ghosts forever bound to haunt it. Their epic, tragic romance was their prison. Eleanor Vance felt the weight of the name Thorne fall from her shoulders. She was no longer a placeholder, a shield, or a wife. She was the architect of her own life, the ruler of her own nascent empire. The story of the Mafia boss and the maid was over for her. It was now just a footnote in a much grander story that was only just beginning. Her own. She walked calmly to the waiting car, her silhouette sharp and clear against the darkness. A queen leaving a conquered land behind. The car door opened and she got in, leaving the gilded cage and all its drama behind forever. What would you have done? One line in the comments, let's argue it out together. Where did the story catch you? Which scene made you stop and think? A small like is a small move, but it's a big support for this channel. See you in the next story. Subscribe so you don't miss it.